Thank you for joining me. I want to begin not with a framework, but with an observation that has followed me across nearly every context in which I've had the privilege to learn alongside others, as a special educator, as an instructional coach, as a graduate professor, and as a learning experience architect working at the intersection of systems design and human development. Again and again, I have encountered extraordinarily capable people who were successful by every external measure. They completed the assignments, they demonstrated competency, they met the expectations, and they earned the credentials. And yet, when asked who they were becoming through the process, many struggle to answer that question. That is the tension that has stayed with me because if education changes what we know, but leaves untouched how we understand ourselves as learners, practitioners, and leaders, then I would argue that we have only partially fulfilled our responsibility. So the work I'm sharing today emerged from that question. It's grounded in years of practitioner inquiry, in iterative design, graduate instruction, and reflective coaching. But it is also deeply informed by a broader philosophical proposition that's explored throughout Dr. Lubin's Learner's Guide to Life, that learning is not an isolated event or a collection of academic outcomes. Learning is a living system. And if learning is a living system, then identity cannot be treated as an afterthought. Identity becomes part of the architecture itself. So today I would like to explore what becomes possible when we begin designing educational systems with that assumption at the center. For the past several decades, conversations about inclusion have rightly focused on access. How do we remove barriers? How do we ensure participation? How do we create equitable opportunities for learners with diverse needs? These questions matter. They've changed institutions, influenced policy, and expanded opportunity for countless people. I want to be very clear that nothing I share today is intended to diminish that progress. Instead, I want to suggest that another question has been waiting beneath it. What if inclusion is not only about whether learners can enter a space? What if it is equally about whether they can locate themselves within it? Over time, I found myself noticing that access and belonging are not synonymous. Accommodation and identity are not synonymous. Participation and transformation are not synonymous. A learner may be fully included procedurally while still experiencing profound uncertainty about their place, their contribution, or their capacity to evolve. That realization led me away from thinking about inclusion exclusively as an accessibility problem and toward understanding it as a design challenge, not simply the design of environments, but the design of experiences that invite learners into an ongoing relationship with their own becoming. When we examine many of our educational systems, we discover that they are remarkably effective at organizing information. They sequence content, they establish competencies, create standards, and evaluate performance. What they often do less intentionally is create structured opportunities for learners to examine how meaning itself is being constructed. In other words, we teach disciplines, we teach skills, and we teach professional behaviors. But we spend comparatively little time teaching learners how to understand themselves as adaptive systems operating within changing contexts. Across my own work in graduate education, I began noticing that students were often searching for certainty when what they actually needed was discernment. They wanted to know the right answer. And the more important developmental task was learning how to ask increasingly better questions. So, this observation ultimately shaped that philosophy underlying Dr. Lubin's Learning Guide to Life. The guide proposes that learning should not be understood as a transaction in which information moves from expert to novice. Rather, learning is an ecological process through which individuals continually reorganize relationships among knowledge, experience, context, identity, and action. So, if that proposition is true, then inclusion itself requires redesign. not because existing efforts are insufficient, but because they remain incomplete. I often think about compliance and design as answering fundamentally different questions. Compliance asks, what must we do? Design asks, who are we becoming? Compliance asks whether learners have access to resources, while design is asking whether those resources cultivate agency for the learner. Compliance asks whether barriers have been removed, and design asks whether environments invite participation, reflection, experimentation, and growth. The distinction may appear subtle, but I believe it changes everything because educational systems are never neutral. Every syllabus communicates values, every grading policy, every assessment communicates values, and every interaction between educator and learner communicates assumptions about intelligence, capability, and possibility. So in Learner's Guide to Life, I describe these relationships as elements of a broader learning ecosystem. The system is always teaching. The only question is, what is it teaching? When viewed through that lens, inclusion becomes less about isolated accommodations and more about intentionally designing ecosystems in which diverse learners can meaningfully engage with both content and themselves. Perhaps the most significant shift that I am proposing today is a shift in how we conceptualize identity itself. Educational discourse often treats identity as descriptive, something learners possess. It's a demographic characteristic, a background variable, a category to be acknowledged. But I found it more useful to think differently. Identity is not simply something we have. Identity is something we continuously organize. It responds, it adapts, and it reorganizes itself through experience. So within Dr. Lubin's Learner Guide to Life, this understanding is represented through the learning system loop. It's a recursive process through which experience generates reflection. Reflection shapes interpretation. Interpretation informs action, and then action produces new experience. Learning is not linear, and identity is not static. Development is not a staircase, it's a living system. And once we begin viewing identity through that lens, our work as educators changes as well. We are no longer merely delivering information. We are participating in the design of environments that shape how learners interpret challenge, construct meaning, and imagine future possibilities. For me, that realization reframes inclusion entirely. It moves inclusion from compliance and into consciousness, from accommodation and into architecture, and then from access into becoming. The framework I will introduce today did not emerge from a single discipline. It emerged through synthesis. It sits at the intersection of inclusive education, reflective practice, organizational learning, systems thinking, and identity development. Universal design for learning has already helped us recognize that learner variability is not exceptional, it is expected. Reflective practice reminds us that expertise develops through cycles of interpretation rather than repetition. And systems thinking teaches us that outcomes emerge from relationships among interconnected parts rather than isolated variables. Identity scholarship similarly demonstrates that who we become is continually negotiated through context and experience. My contribution attempts to bring these conversations together. Rather than asking how instructional systems might simply accommodate learner variability, I ask how they might actively participate in supporting adaptive identity development. That shift may appear conceptual, but I would argue it is profoundly practical because every educator is already shaping identity. The only remaining question is whether we are doing so intentionally. So at this point, I want to introduce the concept that gives this framework its name, archetypal inquiry. And before I explain what it is, I want to begin with what it's not. It's not a personality assessment, and it's not a typology. It is not an attempt to categorize humans into fixed identities or prescribe static roles. In fact, I would argue that many of our educational systems already suffer from an over-reliance on categorization. We categorize learners by achievement level, disability status, demographic variables, professional titles, developmental stages, and countless other descriptors that may be administratively useful but pedagogically limiting. Archetypal inquiry offers a different orientation. Rather than asking, "Who are you?" it asks, "How are you organizing meaning in this moment?" The distinction is subtle, but it changes the nature of reflection entirely. Throughout Dr. Lubin's Learner's Guide to Life, the archetypes are described not as identities to inhabit permanently, but as recurring patterns of intelligence that become available to us as we navigate changing developmental demands. Sometimes wisdom requires curiosity. Sometimes it requires observation, or sometimes it requires decisive action. Sometimes it requires surrender. The same individual may embody each of these orientations over the course of a single day. Archetypal inquiry, therefore, becomes less about self-definition and more about cultivating self-awareness. It provides learners with language for noticing the perspectives they are bringing into an experience and considering alternative ways of engaging with complexity. For educators, this matters because reflection becomes generative rather than evaluative. The objective is not to decide whether one responded correctly. The objective is to understand the architecture through which that response emerged. If archetypal inquiry provides the reflective methodology, then identity architecture provides the conceptual model that holds it together. The language of architecture is intentional. Architecture concerns relationships. It concerns structures, and it concerns environments that make certain experiences possible while constraining others. When I describe identity as architecture, I'm not using metaphor simply for poetic effect. I'm making a systems claim. Identity functions as an organizing structure through which learners interpret information, assign meaning, navigate uncertainty, and make decisions. And like any architecture, it is continuously being renovated. Every conversation leaves an imprint, every success reinforces certain narratives, and every failure invites reinterpretation. Every institution participates in construction. The implication for educational design is significant. We often imagine that curriculum shapes knowledge while identity develops elsewhere. I believe those processes are inseparable. Curriculum shapes identity, so does assessment, feedback, and silence. The absence of representation also shapes identity. The presence of authentic reflection also shapes identity. In Dr. Lubin's Learner's Guide to Life, learning is described as a living ecosystem composed of interacting structures rather than isolated competencies. Identity architecture extends that proposition by suggesting that educational systems are continuously participating in the design of learners' internal organizing frameworks. The educator then is not merely a transmitter of information. The educator becomes an architect of developmental possibility. One of the questions I'm asked most frequently is, which archetype am I? And my answer is almost always the same. The more interesting question is, which archetype does this moment require? That shift reflects the central philosophy of this work. Adaptive expertise is not measured by consistency. It's measured by responsiveness. Consider a doctoral student beginning an unfamiliar research project. Initially, they might need to embody the seeker, remaining open, curious, and willing to tolerate uncertainty. As the work progresses, they may move into the builder, translating ideas into structure. Later, they may become the teacher, synthesizing insights for others. And eventually, they may embody the steward, considering the ethical implications of how that knowledge is shared and sustained. None of these orientations is inherently superior. Each becomes valuable within particular contexts. In many ways, this resembles ecological adaptation. Healthy ecosystems do not depend on uniformity, they depend on diversity and responsiveness. Likewise, healthy learners cultivate the capacity to shift intelligently among multiple ways of knowing rather than becoming rigidly attached to any single identity. This flexibility is especially important in graduate education and organizational leadership, where complexity increasingly requires interdisciplinary thinking, emotional agility, and contextual discernment. The second dimension of this framework concerns time. Educational systems often communicate an implicit expectation that development should be continuous, upward, and linear. Students are expected to progress, professionals are expected to accumulate expertise, and organizations are expected to scale. When we observe living systems more broadly, we encounter a different pattern. Forests regenerate through cycles, communities evolve through cycles, organizations experience periods of expansion, consolidation, disruption, and renewal. Human development appears to function similarly. Within Dr. Lubin's Learner's Guide to Life, this cyclical understanding is represented through the seasonal cycle wheel, which recognizes that emergence, growth, integration, and release each contribute necessary forms of learning. This framework invites educators to reconsider what we interpret as stagnation. The learner who appears paused may actually be integrating. The learner asking fundamental questions may be entering emergence. The experienced practitioner revisiting beginner's uncertainty may not be regressing, but reorganizing. Understanding learning as cyclical rather than linear transforms our interpretation of struggle. Difficulty becomes data, and pause becomes process. Reflection becomes productive work rather than a temporary interruption of progress. For inclusive systems, this shift is profound because it legitimizes multiple rhythms of development rather than privileging only visible acceleration. So if identity architecture describes the structure and developmental energies describe that rhythm, then the archetypal inquiry cycle describes the process. The cycle begins with lived experience. But experience alone does not necessarily produce learning. Experience must first encounter reflection. Reflection then invites interpretation, and interpretation influences future action. Action will generate new experience, and the cycle begins again. This recursive pattern closely mirrors the learning system loop articulated in Learner's Guide to Life, emphasizing that learning is fundamentally iterative rather than accumulative. Knowledge does not simply stack, it reorganizes, meaning does not merely increase, but evolves. So archetypal inquiry inserts an additional interpretive layer into this process by asking learners to examine not only what occurred, but how they were relating to what occurred. What assumptions guided their attention? And what role were they unconsciously inhabiting? What alternative orientation might have generated a different outcome? These questions cultivate metacognitive awareness while simultaneously supporting adaptive expertise. The result is reflection that becomes intentionally developmental rather than merely descriptive. Everything I have described thus far emerged through practice before it became theory. The framework was not developed in isolation. It evolved through years of iterative implementation across graduate coursework, instructional coaching, portfolio assessments, and learner-centered systems design. In many respects, this work reflects the principle of design-based practitioner research. Ideas were introduced into authentic contexts. Learner responses generated new questions, and observations informed redesign. The framework itself continued adapting through cycles of implementation and reflection. What I found particularly compelling was not simply that learners enjoyed archetypal reflection, rather, they began using it spontaneously. They adopted its language to discuss difficult professional decisions. They referenced archetypal perspectives while planning instruction, and they applied cyclical models of development when reflecting upon personal setbacks. Perhaps most importantly, they began shifting away from deficit oriented interpretations of themselves. Instead of saying, I'm not good at this, they increasingly asked, what perspective have I not yet considered? That movement from fixed evaluation toward adaptive inquiry is in many ways the heart of this presentation, because once learners begin understanding identity as dynamic architecture rather than a permanent structure, educational systems become capable of supporting transformation instead of merely documenting performance. And that, I believe, represents one pathway beyond compliance-based inclusion and toward genuine learner-centered design. When I began integrating archetypal inquiry and identity architecture into graduate learning environments, I was not attempting to validate a theory. I was attempting to solve a practical problem. Again and again, I encountered learners who could articulate what they had done, but struggled to explain why they had done it, how they had changed through the process, or what assumptions had organized their decisions. Their reflections described events. They rarely described transformation. Over multiple cycles of implementation, something began to shift. Learners became increasingly capable of locating themselves within their own developmental processes. Their reflections moved beyond performance toward interpretation. And instead of documenting whether an intervention succeeded or failed, they began asking what they had learned about themselves as decision makers. This distinction is subtle but educationally significant because reflection is not valuable simply because it looks backwards. Reflection becomes valuable when it reorganizes a future perception. I also observed an increase in learners' willingness to tolerate ambiguity. Rather than immediately searching for the correct strategy, they became more comfortable exploring competing interpretations, recognizing uncertainty as part of the professional judgment rather than evidence of inadequacy. Perhaps the most encouraging pattern was a noticeable reduction in deficit-oriented language. Learners increasingly shifted from statements like, I don't think I'm good at this, towards questions such as, what conditions would allow me to engage this differently? Or, what perspective have I not yet considered? To me, that shift represents more than an improved reflection. It represents the emergence of adaptive expertise. I would like to briefly illustrate what this looks like in practice. Imagine a graduate candidate completing a clinical observation. Traditional reflective prompts might ask, what went well? What would you improve? What evidence supports your conclusions? And those are useful questions, but they often remain focused on products rather than processes. Through archetypal inquiry, the conversation changes. The learner might instead ask, how was I orienting myself toward the situation? Was I entering an observer when the moment required a builder? Was I attempting to solve before I had sufficiently sought understanding? Was I holding certainty where curiosity might have been more appropriate? Notice that none of these questions pathologize the learner. None of them imply deficiency. Instead, they assume developmental flexibility. They assume that identity is responsive rather than fixed. Across portfolio conferences and coaching sessions, I repeatedly found that learners could engage these questions with remarkable sophistication. They began recognizing that professional growth was not simply the accumulation of techniques. It involved becoming increasingly intentional about how they organized attention, interpreted complexity, and chose action. In many ways, they were no longer simply learning instructional practice, they were learning how to learn. And for me, that lies at the center of learner-centered education. So at this point, I would like to zoom out because while archetypal inquiry has immediate implications for individual reflection, I believe it is more significant. The more significant contribution may lie at the organizational level. Organizations themselves are learning systems. They possess assumptions and they develop habits and they reinforce particular ways of seeing. And like individuals, they often become attached to identities that once served them but no longer support future adaptation. When institutions conceptualize inclusion primarily as an accommodation, they tend to intervene after barriers become visible. Identity-centered design asks a different question. What if we designed environments that continuously cultivated adaptability before crisis emerged? What if coaching systems and assessment structures, leadership development, and curriculum design all explicitly recognize identity as part of learning rather than external to it? That shift transforms inclusion from a reactive service model into a proactive design philosophy. Instead of asking how we can support learners once they struggle, we begin asking how our systems might cultivate the capacities that enable learners to navigate complexity in the first place. The conversation moves from remediation toward architecture, and I believe organizations benefit enormously from making this shift. One question I'm often asked is whether this framework is intended to replace universal design for learning, and the answer is unequivocally no. In fact, I see archetypal inquiry and reflective design as deeply aligned with the aspirations of UDL. Universal design has helped us recognize that variability among learners should be anticipated rather than accommodated only after the fact. It invites flexibility in representation, engagement, and expression. Identity architecture extends that conversation one step further. It asks not only how learners access content, but how they understand themselves while engaging it. How does agency develop? How does confidence emerge? And how do learners interpret challenge? How do they make sense of uncertainty? If these questions complement rather than compete with universal design, it helps us design not only for multiple pathways into learning, but also helps us understand how learners travel those pathways and how those journeys contribute to their professional becoming. So for me, these frameworks are not parallel, they are mutually reinforcing. Together, they create opportunities to design educational systems that are simultaneously accessible, adaptive, reflective, and deeply human. As I conclude, I want to emphasize that this framework is not limited to graduate teacher education. Although that is where much of its development had occurred, the underlying principles are broadly transferable. Leadership development programs could integrate archetypal inquiry into executive coaching. Professional learning communities could use identity architecture to structure collaborative reflection. Portfolio assessments might shift from documenting competencies toward documenting developmental reasoning. And organizations engaged in transformation initiatives could use archetypal language to explore cultural assumptions without immediately personalizing disagreement. Even outside formal education, I believe these ideas offer practical value because every community eventually confronts the same challenge. How do we help people remain adaptive in environments that are increasingly complex? My own answer has become progressively simpler over time. We teach them to study themselves as learners, not to optimize endlessly and not to perfect themselves, but to cultivate the discernment required to participate consciously in their own development. That, to me, is lifelong learning. So I would like to close by returning to the question that opened this presentation. What if inclusion is not primarily an accessibility problem? What if it is fundamentally an identity design problem? After years of working alongside learners and designing educational systems, I have come to believe that our institutions are always doing more than delivering curriculum. They are teaching people how to interpret themselves, sometimes intentionally, often unintentionally. Every educational experience communicates a theory of learning. Every assessment communicates a theory of competence. And every organizational culture communicates a theory of belonging. The work I've shared today represents one attempt to make those theories explicit, to design them consciously, and to recognize that identity is not fixed but responsive, and that learning is not linear but living. That reflection is not that reflection is not ultimately retrospective documentation, but developmental architecture. And perhaps most importantly, that inclusion is not something that we add onto educational systems after they're built. It's something that we should design into them from the very beginning. So in Dr. Lubin's Learner's Guide to Life, I write that people are often not unmotivated, but miseducated, that they have been taught what to learn without being taught how to understand themselves as learners moving through changing contexts. And that idea has become the foundation of this work because when we help learners understand themselves as adaptive systems rather than static identities, we do more than increase participation. We increase possibility. And when organizations intentionally cultivate that possibility, they become places where people are not merely accommodated, they are invited to become. So thank you for your attention, your scholarship, and your willingness to imagine education systems that move beyond compliance and toward conscious design. I look forward to the conversations that in this work and the conversations that this work may continue to inspire. Please feel free to connect with me here, LinkedIn, Instagram, my website, and my email address. I look forward to hearing from all of you.